14 hours. That was the number on the chrono wall when Sierra Voss walked into Lecture Hall 9 and found every seat taken except hers. 14 hours until the Directorate's vote on Provision 18, the motion to strip all non-treaty species of combat track eligibility at the Cascal Interstellar Strategic Institute. Non-treaty species meant humans. There was exactly one human enrolled in the combat track, and she was standing in the doorway with a gym bag over one shoulder and chalk dust still on her fingers from the climbing wall. The hall was tiered, built for 200, holding maybe 90 this morning. The ceiling arched high above rows of polished stone benches that curved inward like the throat of some vast instrument. Holographic scheduling grids floated above the lecturer's pit, cycling through rotation blocks and assessment dates. The light was clean and bright, the way it always was in the Institute's central wing. No shadows, no warmth, just the flat institutional glow of a place designed to see everything and forgive nothing. Sierra dropped the bag at the end of her assigned row, fourth tier up, and sat down. The Vothran cadet next to her, a broad-shouldered female named Thesic, whose skin had the matte indigo hue of deep-current Vothran and whose four-fingered hands rested on the desk with the stillness of someone practicing composure, glanced at her, and then looked forward again without speaking. Nobody was speaking. That was the first wrong thing. Normally, Lecture Hall 9 sounded like a low-grade weather system before the instructor arrived. The clicking of Tessari mandibles as they sub-vocalized notes, the soft flutter of Palathigil crests adjusting to the hall's dry air, the rumble of Kethran cadets shifting their bulk on benches designed for smaller frames. This morning the hall was quiet in the way a room gets quiet when the argument has already happened, and what remains is aftermath. Sierra's combat tutor, Instructor Mivran a Tessari, precise and brittle, with compound eyes that tracked 5 points simultaneously, and a thorax that creaked when she was displeased, was not at the lectern. Instead, the holographic display above the pit showed a single administrative notice in 3-language parallel text. Directorate Session 1140C Agenda Item, Provision 18. Vote, 600 tomorrow. All combat track CADETS excused from afternoon sessions for preparatory review. Sierra read it twice. The phrase preparatory review was new. She had been at the Institute for 11 months and had never seen the Directorate excuse cadets from anything. The Cascal Institute did not excuse. It assigned, it assessed, it ranked, and it filed. If you missed a session, the absence went into your composite score like a stone into still water, and the ripples touched everything downstream. Preparatory review meant the Directorate wanted the cadets out of the building while the politics happened. The cadet on Sierra's other side, a Rithal named Drenek, thin and angular, with pale amber skin, and eyes set so wide on his narrow skull that he could watch both exits simultaneously, leaned toward her without turning his head. "You should not be here," he said, very quietly, in the flat inflectionless register that Rithal used when they were being careful. "I'm on the schedule," Sierra said. "You are on the schedule. You are also on the agenda." Sierra looked at him. Drenek's wide-set eyes were fixed forward, watching the holographic notice, but the fine translucent membranes along his jawline, the ones Rithal used for ambient temperature sensing, were flared, which meant elevated stress. Drenek was not someone who stressed easily. He was third in the combat track composite rankings and had once dislocated his own shoulder during a grappling exam, reset it on the mat, and finished the bout without changing expression. "How long have you known?" Sierra asked. The draft language circulated among the senior cadets 2 days ago. Provision 18 removes combat track eligibility for any species that has not signed a bilateral defense treaty with the Cascal Compact. Your species has not signed one. You are the only non-treaty cadet in the combat track. I'm the only human in the Institute. Yes. Sierra leaned back. She could feel the chalk residue cracking in the creases of her palms. She had spent 90 minutes on the climbing wall before coming here, not the Institute's climbing wall, which was a smooth-surfaced vertical obstacle course, calibrated to test grip endurance across 6 species hand morphologies, but the raw rock face behind the eastern maintenance block that no one used because it was ungraded and therefore did not count toward anything. Sierra climbed it because it was the closest thing at the Institute to the granite bluffs she had grown up scaling on Earth's Pacific coast, and because the act of climbing something that did not count was, in a place where everything counted, the only reliable way she had found to stay sane. She was 19. She had been a competitive sport climber since she was 11, regional champion at 14, national team alternate at 16, declined a collegiate scholarship to accept the Institute's intake offer because her father, a retired Terran Navy flight engineer, had told her over dinner one night that the Cascal Institute was the only place in the sector where a human could learn fleet-grade tactical command, and that no one had ever done it. He had said it the way he said everything, as a fact, with a glass of water in his hand, waiting to see what she would do with it. She had applied the next morning. The aptitude battery had taken 3 days. The physical assessment had taken 2, and that was where the Institute had first noticed something it did not know how to categorize. Sierra could not outlift a Kethrin. She could not outrun a Rithal over a sprint distance. She could not match a Tessori's reflexive reaction speed or a Vothran's raw grip strength. On every individual metric, she placed in the bottom quartile for the combat track. But the assessment included a composite endurance block, a 12-hour rotating cycle of physical tasks, cognitive puzzles, sleep deprivation, and environmental stressors designed to simulate sustained operational conditions, and Sierra had finished it with the 3rd highest composite score in the intake cohort. Not because she excelled at any single component, but because she never stopped performing. She did not peak and crash the way the Kethrin did, burning through their fast-twitch reserves in the first 4 hours and then declining. She did not need the Tessori's mandatory rest cycles. She did not overheat the way the Rithal did when the temperature stressor exceeded their narrow comfort band. She just kept going, hour after hour, maintaining a steady output that the assessment algorithm calibrated for species that excelled in bursts, had not expected from a species it had flagged as physiologically inferior. The interview panel, 4 species, none of them human, had asked her one question. Why do you want to train in an institution designed for species that are, by every physiological metric, faster, stronger, and more durable than yours? Sierra had answered, because the metrics are wrong about what wins. They had admitted her. 11 months later, she was 23rd in the overall composite out of 312 cadets, 9th in tactical assessment, 1st in endurance protocols. She had broken the endurance record twice, the second time by a margin wide enough that the assessors had rerun the biometric calibration to make sure the equipment was not malfunctioning, and as of 48 hours ago, apparently, a political problem. The Chronowall Post. 13 hours, 52 minutes. Instructor Mevrin entered through the lower access and moved to the lectern with the precise, multi-jointed gait that made Tessari look like they were always walking on a surface slightly too smooth. Her compound eyes swept the hall. She did not acknowledge the administrative notice floating above her head. She activated her lesson module and began speaking about fleet maneuver theory, as though the room were not full of cadets who had spent the morning reading the same notice and wondering what it meant for the only human in the building. Sierra took notes. She always took notes, even during lectures whose content she had already studied ahead, and she had studied ahead because the Combat Tracks Module 9 syllabus was available on the Institute's network 3 weeks before the semester block opened, and Sierra had read it the night it posted, the way she read everything the Institute made available. It was not ambition. It was preparation. Humans prepared. It was the trait that the aptitude battery did not test for, and that the composite rankings did not measure the habit of reading the terrain before committing to the route. In climbing, this was called reading the wall. In her father's engineering vocabulary, it was called pre-flight. In the Institute's own tactical doctrine, it was called advanced reconnaissance, and it was taught as a fourth-year skill. Sierra had been doing it since she was 11 when her first climbing coach had told her, "The wall doesn't care if you're strong, it cares if you're ready." She wrote by hand, on a datapad with a stylus, because she had learned early that the act of writing forced her brain to process information differently than listening alone. The Tessari thought this was primitive. The Kethran thought it was slow. The Pelathi found it genuinely fascinating. Their species had a deep cultural attachment to manual notation. And Cadet Rishan, a Pelathi who sat 3 rows ahead and whose gill crests turned a faint rose color when she was intellectually engaged, had once spent 15 minutes after class examining Sierra's notation system with the careful attention of someone studying an artifact. Mivran finished the fleet maneuver block in 40 minutes and dismissed the hall without mentioning Provision 18. As cadets filed toward the exits, Sierra stayed seated. Thesic, the Vothran beside her, paused at the end of the row. "Voss." Sierra looked up. Thesic's four-fingered hand rested on the bench edge. Her indigo skin had the slight luminescent shimmer that Vothran displayed when they were working through a decision. The provision requires a 2/3 Directorate vote. There are 9 Directorate seats. 6 are held by treaty species. 3 are not. "I can count." The 3 non-treaty seats are Rithal, Vothran, and Dreshani. The Rithal seat has already indicated support for the provision. The Dreshani seat is vacant. Their representative rotated out last month, and the replacement has not been confirmed. That leaves the Vothran seat as the margin. Sierra watched Thesic's face. Vothran expressions were difficult for most species to read because their features were heavy and symmetrical, built for pressure tolerance rather than social signaling. But Sierra had spent 11 months learning the small tells, the luminescent shifts, the rate of blinking across their deep-set double eyelids, the tension in the jaw muscles that controlled the secondary palate. Thesic was not delivering information. She was making an offer. "Who holds the Vothran seat?" Sierra asked. "Director Vol, he is my uncle." The hall was empty now except for the 2 of them. The holographic display above the pit cycled to its default, the Institute's crest, 3 interlocking orbital rings against a field of black, with the motto in old Kaskal script that translated roughly to "from different origins, one standard." Sierra looked at the crest. Is he going to vote for it? He has not decided. He is a deliberative thinker. In Vothran governance, a deliberative thinker is someone who does not move until they are certain the current will carry them. He will vote with the majority unless he has a reason not to. A reason. A reason that can survive scrutiny, something in the record, something that cannot be dismissed as sentiment. Sierra understood. Thesic was telling her that the vote was not locked, that one seat was persuadable, and that the persuasion would not happen in a back room or through an emotional appeal. It would happen through the record. The Institute's record. Sierra's record. "Thank you," Sierra said. Thesic inclined her head, a Vothran gesture that meant acknowledgement without obligation, and walked out. Her footsteps were heavy and even, the sound of someone who weighed twice what Sierra weighed and moved with the patience of deep water. Sierra sat in the empty hall for 4 minutes. Then she picked up her gym bag and went to find Drenek. He was in the east corridor, leaning against the window wall that overlooked the Institute's orbital approach lane. Beyond the glass, the curve of the planet Kaskal hung in blue-gray silence, its atmosphere thick with the mineral haze that gave the world its name. Drenek was eating a ration strip with the mechanical efficiency of someone who treated food as fuel. "I need to understand the Directorate process," Sierra said. Drenek chewed, swallowed, folded the wrapper into a precise square. Provision 18 was introduced by Director Kelver, Tessari. She chairs the Assessment Oversight Committee and holds the second longest directorate tenure. The provision cites 3 grounds: species-specific combat track failure rates, insurance liability under the Compact's Mutual Defense Clause, and institutional reputation risk. What are the failure rates? Historically, non-treaty species in the combat track have a 62% attrition rate across all cohorts. Treaty species attrition is 31%. What's my attrition risk? Drenek looked at her. His wide-set eyes blinked in sequence left, then right, the way Rithal did when they were recalculating. You are not at risk of attrition. You are 23rd Composite, 9th Tactical, 1st Endurance. Your Module 8 kinetic assessment was the highest score recorded by a sub-100 kilogram cadet in the current academic cycle. Then the failure rate argument doesn't apply to me. The provision is not about you. It is about the category. You are the evidence against the category, but the provision is written to the category. Sierra processed that. It was a clean distinction, and exactly the kind of distinction a bureaucratic institution would use to solve a political problem. The provision did not say remove Sierra Voss. It said remove non-treaty species. The fact that she was the only one in the crosshairs was, on paper, incidental. It reminded her of something her father had said once, during one of the long evenings on the porch in Monterey when he would talk about his years in fleet logistics. The worst decisions in the Navy were never personal. They were categorical. Someone decides a category is the problem, and everyone in the category becomes collateral. That's how you lose good people without anyone signing a removal order. Sierra had been 16 when he said that. She had not fully understood it then. She understood it now. Who introduced the provision? She asked. Director Kelver. Why? Drenek considered the question with the thoroughness his species applied to everything. Kelver chairs the Assessment Oversight Committee. She has advocated for tightening combat track admissions for 3 years. The last 2 proposals were defeated on procedural grounds. Provision 18 is her third approach, and it is better constructed than the first 2. It ties the exclusion to the defense treaty structure rather than to a direct speciesability argument, which makes it harder to challenge on bias grounds. Because it's framed as policy, not prejudice. Correct. Whether it is actually policy rather than prejudice is a separate question, but the framing is what the Directorate votes on. Sierra filed that. Kelver was not careless. She was strategic. This was her third attempt, and she had learned from the first 2 failures. Fighting her on sentiment would not work. Fighting her on her own data might. Can I address the Directorate? Drenek's jaw membranes flattened. Cadets do not address the Directorate. There is no provision for it in the governance charter. Is there a prohibition? Silence. Drenek folded his arms, a gesture Rithal made when they were conceding a point they had not expected to concede. There is no explicit prohibition. There is simply no precedent. Then it's a gap, not a wall. In Rithal jurisprudence, a gap is a wall that has not yet been built. In human engineering, a gap is a door that hasn't been hung. The corridor was quiet. A maintenance drone hummed past at ankle height, its sensors sweeping the floor for debris. There is a protocol, Drenek said slowly. Governance Charter, Section 44. Any individual materially affected by a Directorate action may submit a statement of material interest. The statement is read into the record before the vote. It does not grant speaking rights. It is a written submission. How long? No length restriction. Deadline. It must be filed with the Directorate clerk before the session opens. Sierra checked the chronostrip on the corridor wall. 13 hours, 11 minutes. That's enough, she said. Drenek straightened from the window wall. His jaw membranes settled back to their neutral position, and he looked at her with the evaluative directness that Rithal used when they were deciding whether to invest effort in something. You intend to file a statement? Yes. You will need data. The provision is built on data, and the Directorate will not take a written statement seriously if it relies on argument without evidence. I know. The data you need is in the Institute's own archives. I have read the governance charter. Section 44 does not restrict the filer's access to supporting materials, which means you have the right to request any institutional record that pertains to the provision's subject matter. He paused. I mention this because the archive staff may not volunteer that information. Will you help me? Drenek's jaw membranes twitched the Rithal micro-expression that meant a decision had been made before the question was finished. I will tell you where to look. I will not write your statement. The statement must be yours. Understood. Begin with the attrition records. Then read the defense annex, not the summary, the full annex. There is a subsection that the provision sponsors did not cite. I do not know if they overlooked it or chose to exclude it, but it is relevant. Which subsection? Find it yourself. If I hand it to you and they ask where you found it, you will need to say the truth. The truth should be that you read it. He turned and walked down the corridor without looking back, the way people walked when they had said what they intended to say and nothing more. On her way to the administrative level, she passed the training yard. Through the transparent partition, she could see the afternoon combat block in progress, a Kethrin drill instructor running a grappling rotation for third-year cadets. 2 Kethrin and a Vothrin were on the mat, cycling through a joint lock sequence that used their species' double-hinged or pressure-resistant anatomies in ways Sierra's body could not replicate. She had learned this in her first month. The combat track's kinetic modules were calibrated to treaty species biomechanics. Every joint lock, every throw, every defensive posture assumed a body that was either heavier, more flexible at joints humans did not have, or capable of absorbing impacts that would fracture human bone. Sierra had passed every kinetic module not by learning the techniques as designed, but by reverse engineering them, finding the principle behind the species-specific form, and rebuilding it for a human skeleton. Her grappling instructor, a Kethrin named Rawson, had watched her do this for 3 months before saying anything. Then, after a Module 7 assessment where Sierra had used a hip throw that no Kethrin could replicate because it relied on the rotation range of a human lumbar spine, Rawson had pulled her aside and said, "That is not in the manual." "No," Sierra had said. "It worked." "Yes." Rawson's jaw had set in the lateral spread that meant something between respect and bewilderment. "I do not understand how your species produces technique from a body that should not be able to produce it." "We improvise," Sierra had said, and Rawson had made the low sound that Kethrin made when they were filing information they intended to think about later. That memory was useful now, because it reminded Sierra of something she needed to put in the statement, her kinetic assessment scores. The provision's failure rate argument was built on aggregate data, but Sierra's individual data told a different story. She was not just surviving the combat track. She was performing in the upper tenth of it, in a body that weighed less than any other combat track cadet on the roster. That fact would mean something to a Vothrin, a species that venerated efficiency mass-to-output ratio was one of their core governance metrics. She kept walking, past the training yard, past the cafeteria where the mid-shift meal was being served, and the air smelled of the mineral-rich nutrient compounds the Kethrin favored, and the fermented grain preparations the Tessari ate, and the simple vegetable broth that Sierra had learned to make from the station's limited human-compatible stores. Past the faculty wing, where she saw Instructor Mivrin through a half-open office door, the Tessari's compound eyes tracking a datapad with the intensity of someone rereading something unexpected. Sierra did not stop. She did not know if Mivrin had seen the Directorate notice. She did not know where Mivrin stood. Instructors did not vote on provisions, but they were consulted, and a combat track instructor's opinion on a combat track exclusion carried weight. She filed that too. There were things she could control and things she could not. The statement was in the first category. Mevrin was in the second. On the administrative level, she passed a second-floor corridor window and caught her own reflection in the glass. 19 years old, lean, her dark hair pulled back in the functional knot she wore for climbing and had never bothered to change for class. She was wearing the Institute's standard-issue training pullover gray, unadorned, the same pullover every cadet wore regardless of species, though the sizing had required a custom order because the smallest standard size was built for the Palathi and was still 2 sizes too large across the shoulders. She had folded the cuffs back on her first day and had not unfolded them since. The maintenance quartermaster, a Kethran named Gris who ran the supply depot with the quiet efficiency of someone who had been doing the same job for 30 years, had noticed the folded cuffs during a routine uniform inspection in Sierra's second week and had said nothing. 2 days later, she found a correctly sized pullover in her supply locker. No note, no requisition to sign. Just the pullover, folded with Kethran precision, fitting as though someone had measured her while she slept. Sierra had never mentioned it. She had worn it every day. Small adjustments made by individuals who noticed without institutional policy or approval. That was how accommodation actually worked when it worked, not through provisions, through people who decided to solve the problem in front of them. She went to the Institute's records archive, a long, low-ceilinged room on the administrative level, staffed by a single Dreshani archivist named Pelek who had the species' characteristic patience, a body like a column of rough gray stone, and 6 short arms that could operate 3 data terminals simultaneously. Pelek looked up when Sierra entered and said nothing, which for a Dreshani was a greeting. "I need the Directorate Governance Charter," Sierra said. "Section 44. And the historical combat track performance data for all non-treaty species enrollments, broken by cohort, species, and individual." Pelek's upper pair of arms was already moving across the terminal. Duration of access: as long as it takes. The archive closes at 2200. Then as long as that. Pelek produced the files in 11 minutes. Sierra sat at a reading terminal and began working through them with the same systematic patience she applied to a climbing route, identifying the holds, testing the weight, mapping the sequence before committing to the first move. The data told a story the provision sponsors did not want told. The 62% attrition rate for non-treaty species was real, but it was not what it appeared. In 41 years of combat track records, the Institute had enrolled non-treaty cadets from 14 species. Of those 14, 11 had sent single cadets lone representatives with no institutional support, no species-specific physiological accommodation, and no embassy liaison to advocate for reasonable adjustment. The attrition rate for those 11 species was 81%. The attrition rate for the 3 species that had sent more than 1 cadet and had some form of external support infrastructure was 28% lower than the treaty species average. The aggregate number was being dragged up by systemic abandonment of isolated cadets, not by species incapacity. Sierra wrote that down. Then she looked at the individual records. Cadet Oren Das, Makish species, enrolled 7 years ago. Composite ranking, 44th percentile. Withdrew after 9 months citing physiological incompatibility. But the withdrawal file contained a note from the Institute's medical officer indicating that the incompatibility was the absence of a UV spectrum light supplement that Makish physiology required, a supplement that cost, per the medical officer's estimate, 11 credits per month, and was never provided. Cadet Rieshanval, Tenvari species, enrolled 12 years ago. Composite ranking, 61st percentile. Dismissed after failing the Module 6 atmospheric exposure trial. But the trial protocols listed atmospheric nitrogen content at 26%, well within tolerance for all treaty species, but 8 points above the Tenvari safe threshold, a threshold that was listed in the Institute's own species physiology database and had not been cross-referenced with the trial's environmental parameters. Cadet Duran Mach, Olesi species, enrolled 15 years ago. The Olesi were a low-gravity species, compact and dense-boned, with extraordinary spatial awareness and a tactical aptitude that the admissions board had rated at the 97th percentile. Duran had excelled in every cognitive and strategic module for 6 months. Then the Module 5 kinetic combat block had arrived, and the combat protocols had been run at standard Cascal gravity 1.3 Earth standard, which was the mean operational gravity for treaty species. For the Olesi, whose homeworld ran at 0.6, the kinetic block was the equivalent of fighting in mud. Duran had failed, been reassigned, and withdrawn within the month. The file's closing notation read, "Species unsuitable for combat track kinetics." The notation did not mention that the combat block could have been gravity adjusted, as it already was for the Pelathi, whose homeworld gravity was lower than the Olesi's, if anyone had made the request. Sierra kept reading. The pattern was not subtle once you looked for it. The Institute had admitted these cadets. It had tested them. It had not adjusted anything for them. And then it had recorded their failures as evidence that their species could not perform, a conclusion that proved nothing except that the Institute had not tried. 11 cadets who had been set up to fail not by their biology, but by an institution that had not bothered to accommodate what it had already documented. Sierra wrote each one down, extracted the relevant data points, and assembled them into a pattern that was not invisible so much as ignored. She thought of her own first month. The environmental controls in her assigned quarters had been set to Cascal standard, a temperature range that was comfortable for the treaty species, but ran 6 degrees below human optimal. She had not complained. She had requisitioned an extra thermal layer from the quartermaster, adjusted her sleep schedule to compensate for the increased caloric burn, and moved on. It was a small thing, the kind of thing a human could solve with a blanket and a higher meal allotment. But she had solved it herself, because she knew how to, because humans had been solving environmental problems with improvisation since before they had language. The Makesh cadet who needed a UV supplement did not have that option. The Tenvari cadet who needed a nitrogen adjustment could not simply hold her breath. These were not problems of willpower. They were problems of infrastructure, and the institution had the data to fix them and had not. Then she went deeper. Provision 18's insurance liability argument cited the Compact's mutual defense clause, which required that combat track graduates be deployable within the Compact's joint operations framework. Non-treaty species, by definition, were outside the framework. Training them, the provision argued, created a liability resources spent on personnel who could not be deployed. But the clause had a subsection. Sierra found it at the bottom of page 47 of the Defense Annex, in language so dense it read like it had been written to be skipped. Any combat track graduate whose individual performance exceeded the cohort median at the time of completion was eligible for attachment to compact operations under an observer protocol, regardless of treaty status. The observer protocol had been used 11 times in the Institute's history. All 11 times, the observer had been subsequently offered a full operational commission. The provision's liability argument had a hole in it, and the hole had a name. It was called being good enough that the rules bent. Sierra wrote that down too. She kept working. At 1900 she stood, stretched, walked 3 laps around the archive's perimeter to keep her legs from stiffening, a climber's habit, and sat back down. At 2030 she began drafting. The archive's lights shifted to their evening spectrum, cooler, bluer, signaling the approach of closing. Pellick had not spoken again, but Sira noticed that the Dreshani archivist had placed a small container of water and a nutrient bar at the edge of her terminal at some point during the last hour. She had not seen Pelek do it. 6 arms, and the archivist moved like a species that had perfected silence over geological time. Sira ate the bar, drank the water, and said without looking up, "Thank you." Pelek's lower pair of arms made a gesture that Sira had never seen a Dreshani make before, a slow lateral sweep, palm down, close to the body. She did not know what it meant. She would learn later from a xenocultural reference that it was the Dreshani gesture for "the work is its own justification." Archivists used it when they believed that a question being asked of the records was the right question, regardless of the answer. She kept writing. At 19:30, the archive door opened. Sira glanced up, expecting another researcher. Cadets sometimes came in the evenings to pull module reference materials. Instead, it was Thesic. The Vothran walked to the terminal 2 seats from Sira's, sat down without speaking, and began reading from a datapad she had brought with her. Sira could not see the screen at that angle, but Thesic's luminescence was at the warm, focused setting that meant active processing. After 20 minutes, Thesic spoke without looking up. "The Dreshani seat." Sira waited. The Dreshani Directorate representative rotated out 23 days ago. The replacement has not been confirmed because the Dreshani Central Assembly is in a succession review standard for their governance cycle, occurs every 9 years. The seat will remain vacant until the review concludes, which is projected for 41 days from now. Meaning the seat cannot vote. Meaning the vote proceeds with 8 seats, and 2/3 of 8 is 6. Kelver needs 6 votes. Without the Dreshani seat, she has the same margin but 1 fewer variable. Does that help or hurt? It eliminates an unknown. The Dreshani seat would likely have abstained. Their species does not vote on provisions they have not been briefed on, and the new representative would not have been briefed. An abstention on a 2/3 threshold counts the same as a no vote. Kelver knows this. She timed the provision to coincide with the vacancy. Sira set her stylus down. She timed it. Thesic's luminescence shifted. Director Kelver is Tessari. They do not leave system variables unaccounted for. The Dreshani seat was the one seat most likely to abstain, and an abstention lowers the threshold she needs to clear. If she had introduced the provision while the Dreshani representative was seated and briefed, the representative might have voted no. Dreshani governance is deeply hostile to categorical exclusions of any kind. Their entire civilization is built on the principle that every functional unit has a role. Removing the Dreshani vote from the equation was not an accident. Sira felt the shape of it now, the full architecture of Kelver's strategy. 3 years of preparation, 2 failed proposals that had taught her what arguments the Directorate would reject, a 3rd proposal timed to a governance gap that eliminated the most hostile vote, a data argument built on aggregate numbers that were technically accurate but structurally misleading. This was not a policy disagreement. It was a campaign, and Kelver had been running it with the strategic patience of a species whose neural architecture processed information like a system, not a story. "Your uncle," Sira said, "Director Vol. If Kelver has been planning this for 3 years, she has spoken to him." "She has, twice. Once formally, once at a faculty event. My uncle said she presented the insurance liability argument both times. She did not mention the observer protocol subsection. Because it undermines the liability argument. Because it eliminates it entirely. If a non-treaty graduate can be attached to compact operations through the observer protocol, the resource waste argument is void. Kelver either does not know about the subsection, unlikely for a Tessari who chairs the Assessment Oversight Committee, or she knows about it and chose not to cite it. Chose. That is my assessment. Sira picked up her stylus again. The statement needed to cite the observer protocol subsection prominently, with the full text and present it not as something Sierra had discovered but as something the provision's sponsors had omitted. The distinction mattered. In a room of institutional minds, an omission in a policy document was a more serious charge than a flaw in reasoning. Flawed reasoning could be corrected. Selective omission implied intent. At 2015, Thesick stood. She had not told Sierra what she was reading on her datapad, and Sierra had not asked. The Vothran inclined her head and walked out. Her luminescence, as she left, was at the warm setting, not the neutral of disengagement, but the active warm of someone whose processing was ongoing and productive. At 2030, Sierra began drafting the final version of the statement. The structure crystallized as she wrote. She did not argue, she did not appeal. She presented the institution's own data, organized in a sequence that the Directorate's 5 different species-specific processing architectures could each engage with on their own terms. The statistical breakdown for the Tessari, who thought in systems. The individual case studies for the Pelathi, who thought in records. The resource efficiency calculation for the Vothran, who thought in ratios. The tactical cost-benefit for the Kethran, who thought in outcomes. And the procedural gap for the Rithal, who thought in structures. 5 audiences, 1 statement, every argument sourced to the Institute's own files. At 2147, she had her statement of material interest, 3 pages. She had written it by hand first on her datapad, then transferred it to the official submission format. It was structured the way her father had taught her to structure an engineering brief. The problem, the data, the alternative, the ask. The problem. Provision 18 used aggregate data to justify a categorical exclusion that the individual data did not support. The data. The attrition disparity was a function of institutional neglect, not species limitation. The insurance liability argument was voided by the observer protocol subsection that the provision's sponsors had not cited. The institutional reputation argument was undermined by the fact that the Institute's own motto, from different origins, one standard, explicitly committed the institution to species-blind assessment. The alternative, rather than categorical exclusion, implement an individual performance threshold for non-treaty, cadets the same threshold that already existed in the observer protocol subsection. The ask, read the data before voting on the category. She filed it with the Directorate clerk, a Pelathi named Sareen, whose gill crests turned a thoughtful gray-green when she read the submission header at 2203. The clerk confirmed receipt, logged the filing time, and told Sierra that the statement would be distributed to all 9 Directorate seats before the morning session. Sierra went back to her bunk. She set an alarm for 5:30 and lay on her back in the dark, staring at the ceiling, running through the data in her head the way she ran through a route sequence before climbing it, not rehearsing the words, but testing the structure, looking for holds that might crumble. She thought about Kelver. The Tessari director had built the provision carefully, 3 arguments, each one supported by institutional data, each one framed in the language of policy rather than species bias. It was a strong structure, but strong structures had weak points, and Sierra had found 3. The attrition data was incomplete, the liability argument ignored its own exception, and the reputation argument contradicted the Institute's founding commitment. 3 holds, enough for a climb. Whether they would hold her weight was a question she could not answer until she was on the wall. She thought about her father. The last thing he had said before she boarded the shuttle, not the day she left for the Institute, but the day she left home for the relay port, which was a different goodbye, was, "If they ever come for your seat, don't argue about the seat. Argue about the floor it's standing on." She had not known what he meant at the time. She knew now. At some point she slept because the alarm woke her at 5:30. She silenced it, swung her legs off the bunk and sat in the dark for 30 seconds, running through her statement one more time. The structure held. The data was clean. The ask was reasonable. Good enough. She stood up. She went through her morning routine, the same sequence she had followed every morning for 11 months, the sequence her father had taught her before she left for the relay port. Wash, dress. Check the day's schedule. Eat something even if you are not hungry, because the body runs on fuel, not adrenaline. She ate a ration bar from the store she kept in her locker, human standard, shipped from Earth's orbital supply chain, one of 4 dietary accommodations the Institute had made for her. 4. The UV supplement for the Makesh cadet would have been a 5th. The nitrogen adjustment for the Tenvari would have been a 6th. Neither had happened. Sierra ate her ration bar and thought about what it cost an institution to not care. The chrono strip in the corridor said 0 hours, 30 minutes. She was not expecting to be called in. The summons came at 3:47, delivered by a security cadet, a young Kethran whose jaw was set in the rigid lateral spread that meant he was following orders he did not understand. The knock on her bunk's door panel was precise, 3 sharp raps, the Kethran's double-hinged knuckles producing a sound harder and more resonant than any human hand could make. Sierra was already dressed. She had not gone back to sleep after the alarm. She had been sitting at the small desk in her quarters, rereading her statement on the datapad, not because she doubted it, but because that was how she prepared, the way she had prepared for every climbing competition since she was 12, going through the route in her mind until the moves felt inevitable. She splashed water on her face, tied her hair back with the elastic band she kept on her wrist, and followed the Kethran through corridors that were empty and bright in the way that institutional spaces are bright before dawn, lit for function, not for people. The corridors were long and curved, following the orbital station's rotation geometry. The security cadet walked 3 paces ahead, his heavy footsteps landing with the metronomic regularity of a species whose leg muscles fired in precise neural bursts. He did not speak to her. He did not look back. Sierra matched his pace without difficulty. Her stride was shorter, but her cadence was faster, a biomechanical difference she had noticed in her first week and had long since stopped thinking about. Humans compensated. It was what humans did. The Directorate chamber was on the uppermost level of the Institute's administrative tower, accessible by a single lift that required a security clearance Sierra did not have. The Kethran security cadet keyed the lift with his own authorization, stepped inside, and waited for her. The ride was short, 20 seconds, maybe less, but it was long enough for Sierra to notice that the lift's interior was finished in the same polished stone as the rest of the administrative tower, with subtle lighting recessed into the ceiling that illuminated the space without creating shadows. The Institute did not believe in shadows. It believed in visibility. Every surface, every corridor, every room was lit to institutional standard, bright, even, comprehensive. The message was architectural. Nothing is hidden here. Sierra had never been inside the Directorate chamber. She had seen it referenced in the governance charter as Chamber 1, Administrative Tower, Level 12, a designation that stripped it of any weight and made it sound like a supply closet. The door was a single slab of polished stone Cascal granite, dark gray with veins of pale blue mineral that caught the corridor light in thin, bright lines, and it opened silently as the security cadet stepped aside. He did not follow her in. His assignment ended at the door. What happened beyond it was not his jurisdiction. The chamber was smaller than she had expected. A curved table, 9 seats, the Institute's crest projected on the wall behind. 5 of the 9 seats were occupied. Director Kelver, the Tessari who had introduced Provision 18, sat at the center, her compound eyes catching the light in geometric fragments. To her left, Director Val, the Vothran, heavy and still, his luminescent skin at its dimmest setting, which meant he was observing without committing. To Kelver's right, the Rithal director, a male named Torvan, whose wide-set eyes tracked Sierra the moment she entered. 2 more seats held treaty species directors Sierra recognized from administrative bulletins but had never met. A Kethran named Dash, whose scarred double-hinged jaw marked him as a combat veteran, and a Pelathi named Own, whose gill crests lay flat in the chamber's dry air. The other 4 seats were empty. It was 3:55 and the session was not scheduled until 600. This was not the vote. This was something else. "Cadet Voss," Kelver said. The Tessari voice was high and precise, each syllable articulated with the clicking undertone their mandibles produced at consonant edges. "You filed a statement of material interest at 22:03 last evening." "Yes, Director." The governance charter provides for written submissions. It does not provide for oral testimony. "I understand that, Director." "You are here because Director Vall requested clarification on your submission's data sources. Under Section 44, a request for clarification may be addressed to the filer in person if a majority of present directors concur. 3 of the 5 present directors concurred. Sierra looked at Vall. The Vothran's heavy features gave nothing away. His double eyelids blinked in slow sequence. "I concurred," he said, in a voice that sounded like gravel settling. "Because the data you cited from page 47 of the Defense Annex has never been cited in any previous Directorate deliberation during my 12-year tenure, and I want to know how a second-year cadet found it." "I read the Annex, Director." "The full Annex?" "The relevant sections." "The Defense Annex is 914 pages." I read efficiently. Vall's luminescence shifted a change in hue, from the deep neutral of observation to a fractionally warmer tone that Sierra had learned to associate with Vothran interest. He was not hostile. He was curious. Kelver was neither. Her compound eyes had not moved from Sierra since she entered, which was unusual for Tessari. They typically tracked multiple points, processing the room as a whole. Fixed attention in a Tessari meant either extreme focus or extreme displeasure. Sierra could not tell which. "The data in your submission suggests that the attrition rate for non-treaty species is primarily a function of institutional support deficit rather than species limitation," Kelver said. "You cite 11 of 14 non-treaty species as having enrolled single cadets with no support infrastructure. You then isolate the 3 species with multiple enrollments and external support, and derive a 28% attrition rate." "That is correct." The sample size for your 28% figure is 17 cadets across 3 species. You are drawing a policy conclusion from 17 data points. Sierra had expected this. The sample size for the 62% figure used in the provision is 43 cadets across 14 species, with 11 of those species represented by a single cadet each. Drawing a policy conclusion from 11 data points of 1 is a weaker statistical position than drawing one from 17 data points of multiple. Director Dash the Kethran leaned forward. His scarred jaw shifted, not the lateral spread of anger, but the forward set of a predator tracking something. "You are arguing that the provision's own data is poorly constructed." "I am arguing that it is incomplete, Director. The provision treats the 62% as a property of the non-treaty species themselves. The individual records suggest it is a property of the conditions the Institute provided to those species. There is a difference between a cadet who cannot meet the standard and a cadet who was never given the tools to attempt it." Dash's lidless eyes held on her for 3 seconds. Then he glanced at Kelver. The glance was brief, but Sierra caught it, and more importantly, she caught that Kelver caught it. A Kethran combat veteran questioning the data integrity of a Tessari director's provision was not a small thing. The Kethran were not political by nature. They were direct, efficient, and deeply uncomfortable with arguments that could not be resolved by straightforward measurement. If Dash was questioning, it was because the data bothered him the way a crooked scope bothered a marksman. The chrono strip on the chamber wall read 2 hours, 3 minutes until the scheduled vote. Torvald, the Rithal director, spoke. His voice was flat, inflectionless, stripped of everything except content. "Cadet Voss, You are aware that this provision, if passed, would require your immediate withdrawal from the combat track and your reassignment to the General Studies program. I am aware. You are also aware that, per your submission, you are currently 9th in tactical assessment and 1st in endurance protocols in your cohort. Yes. And that under the observer protocol subsection you cited, your current performance already qualifies you for compact operational attachment upon graduation. Yes. Then you understand that the provision, as written, would remove a cadet who has already demonstrated qualification for the highest operational track the Institute produces. I understand the provision. I also understand that the provision is not about me. Torvald blinked left eye then right. Explain. The provision is written to a category. I happen to be the only current occupant of that category, but the principle it establishes affects every future non-treaty cadet who might enroll. If the provision passes, the Institute is stating that categorical origin matters more than individual performance. That is the precedent. My statement is not about preserving my seat. It is about whether this institution means its own motto. The crest on the wall glowed softly. From different origins, one standard. Kelver's mandibles clicked a sound that, in Tessari body language, indicated a thought being processed rather than dismissed. The motto is aspirational. Policy must be practical. The observer protocol subsection is practical, Sierra said. It already exists in your framework. It already provides a pathway for non-treaty graduates to serve. The mechanism is there. The provision ignores it. The provision simplifies. Simplification that excludes qualified individuals is not efficiency. It is waste. The word landed. Waste. Sierra had chosen it deliberately. Institutional waste was, for the species represented on the Directorate, a concept that carried weight across every cultural framework in this room. The Tessari were obsessed with systemic optimization. The Vothran measured governance quality by resource utilization. The Rithal organized their entire civilization around the principle that nothing capable of function should be discarded. The Kethran valued combat efficiency above almost everything. Removing a capable asset was a tactical error. Waste was not a human word in this room. It was a universal one. Director Own, the Pelathi, spoke for the first time. Her voice was soft, modulated through the Gilcrest structures that gave Pelathi's speech its layered, harmonic quality. Cadet Voss, you mentioned the individual records of past non-treaty cadets, the ones who were not accommodated. Can you cite a specific example? Sierra could. Cadet Oren Das, Makesh species, enrolled 7 years ago, withdrew after 9 months. The withdrawal was categorized as physiological incompatibility. But the medical file indicates the incompatibility was the absence of a UV spectrum light supplement, a known Makesh physiological requirement that was never provided. The supplement costs 11 credits per month. The Institute's annual per-cadet operating budget is 14,000 credits. Owen's Gilcrests rippled. In Pelathi body language, that was not emotion, it was processing, rapid processing. 11 credits per month. And this was documented in the Institute's own medical file. Yes, Director. Owen looked at Kelver. The look lasted longer than Dash's glance had, and it carried a different weight. The Pelathi were not confrontational, but they were meticulous, and they did not forgive institutional systems that failed to use their own data. A medical file that documented a problem and an institution that dismissed the cadet anyway, that was not a species limitation finding. That was a records failure. And records failures in Pelathi culture were treated with the same gravity that Kethran treated tactical incompetence. Kelver's compound eyes fractured the light into geometric shards as she processed the room's shifting current. Sierra could see it. The Tessari director had entered this session, expecting a clarification that would expose thin data and reinforce the provision's position. The clarification was going the other direction. Director Val shifted in his seat. The movement was small. Vothran did not make unnecessary movements, but Sierra saw it. His luminescence was warmer now, not decided but moving. "There is a practical question," Val said. "If the provision is defeated, the aggregate attrition rate for non-treaty cadets remains a matter of institutional concern. Your submission proposes an individual performance threshold as an alternative to categorical exclusion. Define the threshold." Sierra had prepared for this. The Observer Protocol subsection sets the threshold at cohort median at the time of graduation. I am proposing the same threshold, applied at the end of each academic year rather than only at graduation. Any non-treaty cadet who falls below the cohort median at the annual assessment point would be reviewed for reassignment. Any non-treaty cadet who meets or exceeds it would continue without restriction. "That creates an administrative burden," Kelver said. "It creates an administrative burden of one annual review per non-treaty cadet. There is currently one non-treaty cadet in the combat track. The burden is one review. And if more non-treaty species enroll in the future, then the burden scales linearly, which is the kind of burden institutions are designed to handle." The chronostrip read 1 hour, 47 minutes. Director Torvan leaned forward. The Rithal's jaw membranes were flat, careful thought. "Cadet Voss, I told Director Val 2 days ago that I intended to vote in favor of the provision. I want to tell you why, and then I want you to respond." Sierra nodded. "The Institute's reputation is built on the performance of its graduates within the Compact's operational framework. Non-treaty species, by definition, operate outside that framework. Every resource invested in a cadet who cannot deploy within the framework is a resource diverted from cadets who can. This is not prejudice. It is allocation." Sierra waited a beat. "Director, with respect, the Observer Protocol subsection proves that non-treaty graduates can deploy within the framework. The mechanism exists. It has been used 11 times. All 11 resulted in full operational commissions. The question is not whether non-treaty graduates can serve. The question is whether the Institute acknowledges the pathway it already built." Torvan's eyes blinked in sequence. He did not speak. "I am not asking the Directorate to create something new," Sierra said. "I am asking it to use what it already has. The Observer Protocol was written by this institution. The performance threshold I am proposing is drawn from this institution's own criteria. The data I am citing is from this institution's own archives. Everything in my statement is already inside these walls. I did not bring anything from outside. I just read what was already here." The room held 5 directors, 5 species, 5 different processing architectures working through the same information and arriving, by different paths, at the same uncomfortable conclusion. Their own institution's records contradicted their own institution's provision. Director Kelver's compound eyes shifted all of them, tracking to a point slightly above Sierra's head, the way Tessari did when they were incorporating new data into an existing model. The mandible clicking stopped. "Processing complete." "Cadet Voss," Kelver said, "you understand that this clarification session is informal. It has no bearing on the vote." "I understand. And you understand that even if the provision is defeated, the Directorate may introduce alternative measures at any future session." "I understand that as well." "Then you may return to your quarters." Sierra stood. She did not salute. Human salutes were not recognized in the Institute's protocol, and she had learned in her first week not to impose gestures the institution did not share. She inclined her head, the way Thesic had taught her, and turned toward the door. "Cadet Voss." She stopped. It was Val. "Your Module 8 kinetic assessment score. The one referenced as the highest recorded by sub 100 kilogram cadet. She returned, "Yes, Director." "What do you weigh?" 64 kilograms. Val's luminescence flared bright, warm, unmistakable. In Vothran expression, that was not amusement. It was recognition. The recognition of mass doing more than its weight suggested the central aesthetic of Vothran respect. 64 kilograms, Val repeated, as though tasting the number. Dosh, the Kethran, made a sound low, brief, produced somewhere in the back of his double-hinged jaw. It was not laughter. Kethran did not laugh the way other species did. It was the sound a Kethran combat officer made when a subordinate exceeded a performance threshold by a margin that defied the briefing. Sierra had heard it once before, during a kinetic assessment, when she had completed a reaction timing drill faster than the Kethran cadet who went before her, not because her reflexes were faster, they were not, but because she had read the drill's pattern 2 cycles ahead and started moving before the stimulus triggered. Kelver's compound eyes shifted one final time. The Tessari director did not speak. She did not need to. Her mandibles were still, her thorax was still, and her eyes had returned to their normal multi-point tracking. The fixed focus was gone. Whatever decision she had been processing, it was complete. Sierra did not know which way it had landed, and Kelver's expression gave nothing away. That was the nature of Tessari politics. The data went in, the system processed, and the output arrived when the system was ready, not before. Sierra walked out of the chamber. The stone door closed behind her with a sound like a breath held and released. She went to the climbing wall, not the Institute's graded wall, the raw rock face behind the eastern maintenance block. She climbed in the dark, by feel, her fingers finding the holds from muscle memory, her breathing steady and even in through the nose, out through the mouth, 4 counts in, 4 counts out. The rhythm of a body that knew how to be patient with stone. She was not nervous. She was not hopeful. She was moving and the rock was solid and the rest was not in her hands. This was something she had learned from climbing that the Institute had never taught her and probably could not. The difference between control and influence. On a wall, you controlled your grip, your body position, your breathing. You did not control the rock. You did not control gravity. You did not control whether the hold you reached for would take your weight or crumble. You influenced those outcomes by reading the wall correctly, by placing your weight intelligently, by choosing routes that played to your strengths. But the final answer belonged to the stone, and the stone did not negotiate. The Directorate was stone. Sierra had placed her weight as well as she could. The rest was physics. At the top of the wall she paused. The Institute lay below her in the pale pre-dawn light of Cascal's blue-white star, the curved rooftops, the training yards where cadets who outweighed her by factors of 2 and 3 ran drills she completed without complaint, the docking ring where supply shuttles came and went in their patient rotations. Somewhere beneath her, the Directorate chamber was either in session or about to be. Somewhere beneath her, a provision was either passing or not passing. She could not hear it, could not feel it, could not influence it from up here. All she could do was what she had done, read the record, find the holds, and make the climb. She came back down. The descent was always faster than the ascent, not because she rushed, but because gravity did half the work and her body knew the holds in reverse. At the base of the wall, she pressed her palms flat against the stone for a moment, the way she always did after a climb, feeling the cold surface against her chalk-roughened skin. It was a small ritual, private and meaningless to anyone watching, but it was hers. The wall was hers. This ungraded, uncounted, institutionally invisible piece of rock behind a maintenance block on an orbital station, 4,000 light-years from Earth, was the one thing at the Cascal Institute that belonged entirely to her, because she had claimed it not by assignment or assessment, but by the simple act of climbing it when no one asked her to. She showered, changed into clean fatigues, was in her assigned seat in Lecture Hall 9 when Instructor Mevran arrived at 7:30 for the morning block. The administrative notice on the holographic display had been updated. Directorate Session 1140C Provision 18 Status, Deferred, Further Deliberation Scheduled. All cadets resume standard schedule. Deferred, not defeated, not withdrawn, deferred. Sierra read the word 3 times and understood each reading differently. The first time, relief, brief and physical, a loosening in the muscles across her shoulders that she had not realized were tight. The second time, clarity, deferred was not defeated. The provision still existed. It could be reintroduced at any session. Kelver had not withdrawn it. She had shelved it, and shelved provisions had a way of returning when the political current shifted. The third time, something quieter, harder to name. Not victory. Something more like the feeling at the top of a climb when you reach the ledge and realize the mountain continues above you. The immediate route is done. The mountain is not. In institutional language, deferred meant the votes were not there. It meant someone had moved. It meant the automatic outcome had been disrupted and the momentum had stalled. It did not mean the fight was over. It meant the fight had changed shape, and Sierra knew from 11 months at the Cascal Institute that institutional fights never ended. They evolved, adapted, found new forms. Today it was Provision 18. Next year it might be a budget reallocation that cut the non-treaty support infrastructure before it could be built. The year after that, an admissions committee that simply stopped considering non-treaty applications without announcing a policy change. The architecture of exclusion was patient, and it did not require a single dramatic vote to accomplish what it wanted. Thesick sat down next to her. The Vothran's luminescence was at neutral baseline, but her double eyelids blinked once slowly, deliberately in a pattern Sierra had come to recognize as the Vothran equivalent of a nod between equals. Your statement was distributed to all 9 seats at 4:30, Thesick said quietly. My uncle read it twice. And he said the data was sound. He said the Observer Protocol subsection should have been cited in the provision's drafting. He said he could not vote for a measure that ignored its own institution's mechanisms. Sierra said nothing. She picked up her stylus and opened her datapad to a fresh page. Drenek appeared at the end of the row, took his seat 2 spaces to Sierra's left, and folded his arms. He did not look at her. His jaw membranes were flat. After a moment he said, Director Torvan abstained. Sierra's stylus paused on the datapad. Abstained. He was expected to vote in favor. He abstained. With Vol voting against and Torvan abstaining, the provision did not reach 2/3. Kelver did not call the vote. She deferred. Sierra set her stylus down and looked at the empty lectern below. The holographic crest rotated slowly above it, its 3 orbital rings catching the hall's bright light in patterns that shifted as the projection cycled. From different origins, one standard. She had read those words on her first day at the Institute and had thought they were aspirational, the kind of motto institutions carved into walls and then forgot. She understood now that they were not aspirational. They were a claim, and claims could be tested. She had tested this one, not with rhetoric but with the institution's own files, and the institution had flinched. Sierra absorbed what Drenek had said. Torvan had abstained. The Rithal who had told her to her face that he intended to vote in favor had, after listening to her response, stepped back from the line. He had not voted against. That would have been a reversal, and Rithal did not reverse positions. Their entire governance philosophy was built on the principle that a position, once taken, should only be abandoned if the structural foundation it stood on was proven unsound. Reversal was not a change of mind. It was a confession that the original analysis had been deficient. No Rithal director would make that confession in a public session, but abstention was different. Abstention meant, I had a position, but new data has arrived that I have not yet incorporated into my analysis. It was not retreat. It was the acknowledgement that the ground had shifted and the structure needed re-examination before the next load could be applied. Sierra understood this because Drennick had explained Rithal governance to her in the third week of their first semester, during a tactical analysis exercise where their squad had been assigned to model a political negotiation. He had described the Rithal decision architecture with the same precision he applied to everything. We do not change positions. We update models. If the model changes enough, the position changes as a consequence. The position itself was never the thing. The model was. She had not changed Torvald's mind. She had introduced new variables into his model. In the calculus of institutional politics, that was worth more than a converted vote. A converted vote could be unconverted at the next session. New variables in a Rithal model could not be extracted once entered. They became part of the permanent analytical structure, and every future position Torvald took on non-treaty species eligibility would now incorporate the Observer Protocol subsection, the attrition data breakdown, and the 11 credits per month UV supplement that had never been provided. Those facts would sit in his model like load-bearing columns. You could not remove them without rebuilding the entire structure, and Rithal did not rebuild lightly. Director Dosh also asked the clerk a question after the session, Drennick added, his voice carefully neutral. He asked for the complete medical files of all non-treaty combat track withdrawals in the past 20 years. Sierra looked at him. How do you know that? Peleg, the archivist. He processed the request at 6:14. Dreshani do not gossip. They share data with individuals they consider relevant. Peleg had decided that Sierra was relevant. A Dreshani archivist, a species so patient they measured social decisions in years, had, in the space of one evening, moved her from stranger to relevant. That was not a small thing. It meant the data had traveled. It meant the records she had pulled from the archive were being pulled again, by someone with the authority to act on them. The Kethrin combat veteran was looking at the same medical files she had read, and he was doing it because what he had heard in that chamber did not match what the provision had told him was true. There is one more thing, Drennick said. He unfolded his arms and placed both hands flat on his thighs, which in Rithal body language was the posture of formal declaration. Cadet Rishan filed a supplementary data appendix with the Directorate clerk at 5:40 this morning. She compiled a cross-reference of the Institute's species physiology database against all combat track trial environmental parameters for the past 15 years. She found 9 protocol mismatches, 9 trials, where the environmental conditions exceeded the safe threshold for non-treaty species enrolled at the time, and where the Institute's own database contained the threshold data that would have allowed adjustment. 9 mismatches. 9 times the system had the information and did not use it. She did this on her own, Sierra asked. She is Pelathi. The Pelathi do not act on orders, they act on data. Sierra absorbed that. Rishan had not asked permission. She had not consulted Sierra. She had heard the same information circulating through the Cadet network, gone to the same archive, pulled the same kind of records, and produced an independent corroboration of the pattern Sierra had identified because the Pelathi treated data integrity the way humans treated oxygen. It was not optional. It was the environment you built everything else inside. The provision was not dead, but it was wounded, and the wound had been inflicted not by Sierra alone, but by the institution's own records, read by cadets from 3 different species who had each, independently, decided that the truth in the files mattered more than the convenience of the provision. Mivrin began the morning lecture. The lesson was about formation integrity under asymmetric threat conditions, how to hold a defensive line when the attacking force had capabilities your formation was not designed to counter. The Tessari instructor worked through 3 case studies, each one a historical engagement where a numerically inferior force had survived contact with a superior one by exploiting a structural weakness in the attacker's assumptions. Sierra wrote down every word. She underlined the phrase, structural weakness in assumptions, and drew a small box around it on her datapad. Halfway through the lecture, Cadet Rishan, the Palathi 3 rows ahead, turned in her seat, caught Sira's eye, and held it for 2 seconds. Then her gillcrests flushed rose, the color of intellectual engagement, and in this context, something closer to solidarity. She turned back around without a word. It was the most demonstrative gesture Sira had ever seen from a Palathi in a classroom setting, and it meant more than any spoken encouragement could have, because the Palathi did not perform solidarity. They enacted it quietly, with the precision of a species that treated every visible action as a permanent entry in the social record. At the end of the lecture, Mivrin paused at the lectern. Her compound eyes swept the hall in their characteristic multi-point scan, and then they fixed every facet, every angle on Sira. It lasted 2 seconds. Then Mivrin's thorax creaked, which was the Tessari sound of acknowledgement, and she walked out without a word. 2 rows below Sira, a Kethran cadet named Varro Heavy, scarred across one shoulder from a training accident, not someone Sira had ever spoken to outside of paired drill rotations, turned in his seat as the lecture ended and met her eyes. He did not speak. He inclined his head, not the Vothran gesture of acknowledgement, not the Rithal gesture of data sharing, but the Kethran gesture of tactical recognition. One combatant acknowledging another's position. Then he turned and left. Sira had been at the Institute for 11 months. She had entered as a statistical anomaly, one human, one non-treaty species, one data point in a system designed for others. She had spent those months performing, adapting, reading the institution the way she read a climbing wall, finding the holds that would bear her weight and avoiding the ones that would crumble. She had not sought allies. She had not asked for help. She had done the work, and the work had spoken. What she understood now, sitting in the emptying hall with chalk dust from yesterday still in the grain of her palms, was that the work had been heard not as an argument, not as a plea, but as data. Clean, verifiable, institutional data. The kind the system understood. The kind it could not dismiss as sentiment. She had beaten the provision the same way she beat kinetic assessments that were not designed for her body, by finding the principle beneath the form and rebuilding it from materials the system already had. She stayed in her seat until the hall was empty. Then she picked up her bag and walked to the eastern maintenance block. The rock face was waiting. It had not changed. Rock did not change on human timescales, and that was part of why she climbed it. The holds were exactly where she had left them. The chalk marks from the morning's ascent were still visible, white against gray, a trace record of her passage that would fade with time but not disappear entirely. Chalk was persistent. So were records. She chalked her hands and began climbing. The route she chose was the hard one, the line that ran up the left edge of the face, where the holds were thinner and farther apart, and the angle kicked back at the midpoint in a way that demanded core strength and balance in equal measure. She chose it because the easy route would have felt like a concession, like celebrating, and there was nothing to celebrate. The provision was deferred, not defeated. The institution had adjusted, not reformed. She had won a round, not a match. Halfway up the wall, she paused at a rest position, a small ledge where she could take weight off her fingers and shake out the lactic acid building in her forearms. From here, she could see the training yard below, where the afternoon drill block was starting. Cadets were assembling in formation, Kethran and Vothran and Tessari and Palathi, the full roster of treaty species that comprised the combat track. She watched them for a moment, these aliens who outweighed her and outran her and outpunched her and who she had been competing against for 11 months, and she felt something she had not expected. Not triumph, not pride, but the steady, settled awareness that she belonged here. Not because the institution said so. Not because the Directorate had confirmed her eligibility, because the work said so. Because 9 months of composite rankings and endurance records and kinetic assessments said so. Because the data said so. And in this place, on this station, among these species, data was the only language that could not be overruled by politics. She finished the climb. At the top, she sat on the edge with her legs dangling and looked out over the campus. The chrono strip on the maintenance block wall was visible from up here, small but readable. 0 hours, 0 minutes. The countdown was over. Whatever came next was not a timer. It was a season, and seasons did not count down. They accumulated. She sat there for a while, breathing the thin, processed air of an orbital station that was not her world, watching the light change on the mineral haze of a planet she might never walk on. And then she climbed back down and went to class. The next morning, Sierra found a single notation added to her academic record, visible on her personal dashboard when she logged in before breakfast. It was not a grade. It was not a commendation. It was an institutional adjustment, entered by the Directorate clerk, time-stamped 6:11 minutes after the session that never voted. Combat track eligibility confirmed. Annual performance review authorized. Observer protocol subsection cited for standing reference. 3 sentences. No ceremony. No congratulations. The institution had not praised her. It had adjusted the way institutions do when a single data point forces them to recalibrate without admitting they were wrong. She closed the dashboard. 3 sentences. The institution had processed her intervention, extracted the actionable element, and implemented it without praise, without narrative, without acknowledging that a 19-year-old human cadet had read 914 pages of defense annex in one evening, and found a subsection that 12 years of Directorate deliberation had missed. That was not how institutions said thank you. It was how they said, "You are now part of the load-bearing structure." Sierra thought about the cadets whose files she had read in the archive. Oren Das, who needed 11 credits a month of UV supplement. Rieshan Val, whose nitrogen threshold was in the database but never cross-referenced. Duran Mach, who could have been gravity-adjusted the same way the Pelathi were. Those cadets were gone. The provision had not removed them. Institutional indifference had, years before the provision was written. The provision had merely proposed to formalize the outcome that neglect had already achieved. What Sierra's statement had done was not to save herself. It was to make the pattern visible. And now that it was visible, now that Director Dash was reading the medical files, now that Rishan's cross-reference was in the Directorate record, now that the Observer Protocol subsection had been cited for standing reference, the institution could not unsee it. The pattern was in the record, and records at the Cascal Institute were permanent. She picked up her gym bag and walked to the climbing wall. Drenek was there, leaning against the base of the raw rock face, arms folded, his wide-set amber eyes watching the stone with the evaluative stillness of someone, assessing a problem he was not sure he wanted to attempt. "I have never climbed a surface that does not count toward anything," he said. Sierra dropped her bag. She chalked her hands, rubbed the excess off on her thighs, and looked up at the wall. The morning light was pale and clean, and the holds were exactly where she had left them. "That's the best reason to climb it," she said. She reached for the first hold, and Drenek, after a pause that lasted exactly long enough for a Rithal to decide that an unprecedented act was worth the structural risk, reached for the one beside it. They climbed without speaking. The rock was cold and solid under their fingers, and the institute hummed below them, and the light kept changing, and neither of them looked down.